Welcome back, listeners. I'm Robin Black. This is It's All About Healing podcast. In today's episode, I will be interviewing Hollynd Hoskins. She has been a trial lawyer for over 30 years and is one of Colorado's leading litigators. And what made me reach out to Hollynd was I was actually watching an episode of Kids Behind Bars, and she was working on the Curtis Brooks case. I believe he was 15 when he was involved in a crime. And by the time he was 17, he was given a life sentence for a crime that he didn't commit. And it absolutely moved me because they had worked on this case for 24 years. And I couldn't even begin to imagine what that's like for either party. So I actually, not only do I want to speak to Hollynd in regard to this case, but I also want to speak with Hollynd in regard to what goes on in the mind of a public defender. And it is my pleasure, and I am extremely honored to introduce you to Hollynd Hoskins. Hollynd, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. When I graduated law school in Denver in 1992, and my career started as a public defender, and that's a job that I always wanted to do. And I was a public defender from 1993 until about 2004, so for about 12 years. After that, I went into civil litigation and did complex medical malpractice for severely injured patients and wrongful death cases from 2004 until about 2019. And in 2019 is when I thought maybe I was going to retire early, but too many good cases kept coming my way and I didn't have the ability to say no. So I opened my own firm, Hollynd Law, and that's where I've been practicing since 2019.
Okay. And so you said that you were a public defender, correct?
Absolutely. I worked for the Colorado State Public Defender's Office for 12 years, which is an incredibly stressful job.
Right. And I couldn't even begin to imagine how stressful that is. As you're sitting next to some of these defendants who have committed some gruesome acts, what was that like?
Sure. You know, the job you didn't get to pick your cases. And at times the caseloads were very high, around 120 cases. And you had all different types of clients. You had clients that you were for sure that they were being wrongly charged and they were innocent. Or you had clients that were property crimes and needed a second chance. And it was very difficult representing those clients. And then, as you mentioned, there's also going to be clients that have been charged with very violent crimes, sex assault, homicide, and you are an incredibly busy public defender and you go to the jail and you're sitting in a small room with some of these clients, and that can be incredibly stressful as well. Some of these clients can be mentally ill. I remember there was one client who was so mentally ill and was charged with multiple homicides and a evisceration of body parts. And the sheriffs found a kite or something, a warning that the inmate was going to put a pencil through my coworker's neck.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so you're dealing with all kinds of things. And it's going to cause a little anxiety, to say the least.
I can only imagine. So what's actually going on through your mind during that? Like, was there a sense of fear every single time you went in, or what was that like?
You know, it's not not every single client was like that. The other, you know, there's a lot of good people that do bad things, and there would be no fear. It was just empathy and how can I do the best I can to help this individual. It would be on the rare occasion that with some of the violent, mentally ill clients that you would be afraid. that particular instance where I talked about a mentally ill client that had threatened to, stab you in the neck with a pencil. It's silly, but I remember kind of like practicing, scrunching my neck down, all while you're trying to go read the discovery and the police reports of some of the, gruesome accusations. It made it very interesting and stressful for sure.
I bet. And while in court, what is it like, to have the defendant's family, they have to be falling apart behind you, and then also having the victim's family against you, and they're both sides are grieving. Like, what is that like when you're in the courtroom?
In my early days of my career, when I didn't have the experience and the confidence to know how to handle it, it felt incredibly isolating and overwhelming. Like, you can't even imagine, that situation, that you're responsible for your client's life. You have a caseload of over 100 cases, and yet you walk into the courtroom and the family has been calling and the family is there. So you're trying to navigate and comfort the family. And then you're also dealing with the other half of the courtroom, which are victims' families who have gone through, extreme grief, suffering, and loss, and it all is just colliding into the courtroom. In the early years, you would keep your eyes down, look at the floor. You didn't want to look at the victims. You have to do certain cross-examinations. But as I gained more experience, I always learned it's best to try to go introduce yourself, apologize for their grief, loss, or sorrow, and that you have a job to do and attempt some, restorative justice, or at least some communication and respect, which always helped. But there were a few very stressful times with, drug case homicides or gang-related where the victims' families are all wearing T-shirts lined up in the hallway. I've been spit at just walking down the hallway.
Oh, wow.
With a defendant, in custody going into the courtroom after a not guilty verdict on a particular case. I was told, don't go home. And my client, who I believed was innocent, and I walked, his house was shot up after the verdict. So, a public defender is going to see and, see a lot of bad things.
Oh my goodness. And then that is that is insane. And then you said that you have over 100 caseloads. What is that like when you have to take that home? Like, how do you balance both of those? And just on an average day, what is that like balancing the two?
Sure. It's incredibly difficult if at any one time when I was a public defender, the number of cases would vary, but it can go from 90 cases to 120 cases. And there's just no way to do that job completely effectively at that caseload. And the immense pressure causes anxiety. It causes stress, insomnia, just the overwhelming stakes that are involved, and that you're just constantly going. You don't even have time to process one particular outcome on one case when, if you've been in trial for 3 weeks, you have 100 other clients who are clamoring for your attention. And so it's really difficult to keep a personal life balance when you do a job like this.
And what about coping with the grief yourself from dealing with different cases? What were you ever able to actually grieve?
You just didn't have the time. I know the Curtis Brooks case, since it's had the documentary on it and it's in the public record. After, he was charged with felony murder when he was 15 years old, and I had to go to trial where there was a confession on felony murder. There was not a lot of hope in defending that case. And he was sentenced to life without parole as a 17-year-old. And when the judge read that verdict, his grandmother was in the court and was wailing. And it even though we expected it to hear the guilty verdict and then the immediate life without parole sentence, which was mandatory for a child, it was soul crushing, that moment. And even up to 3 months later, I was completely depressed, felt guilty, felt like I was part of the system that was sentencing children to life without parole. And I really contemplated quitting the job. But at the same time, I had to get up and to do what I can to fight for the next client. You had 100 other clients that were needing your help and your assistance. And it did make you want to get better. But there wasn't a lot of time for self-care, for self-help, to process the trauma that the lawyers are going through, that judges are going through, everyone in the judicial system is going through, not just the defendant, the defendant's family, and of course the victim's family, even law enforcement officers. It's very traumatic mentally.
I can definitely imagine. And is there mental help in that sense? Like, do you guys have scheduled psych evaluations?
When from 1993 to 2004 in Colorado, and Colorado State Public Defenders is one of the top public defender systems, there was no psych evaluations, there was no counselors or mental health support. Now, I was on the Public Defender Commission recently, and the Colorado Public Defender system is so large that they do have more tools. I don't think there's psych evaluations, but there are mental health counselors that the lawyers can go to, is my understanding now. But it's definitely needed, for sure, and for everyone involved in the criminal justice system. But the public defender, a lot of times the defendants, you're the only person that they may have, the only person that, you're carrying all of their burdens. And also at the same time, you're the person that is going to receive their anger, their resentment about the system. And so it is definitely a very difficult role.
Right. I get that. And then I know, speaking of which, with the anger, I know previously when we actually spoke about the Curtis Brook case, you stated that he cussed you out, and that was I'm sorry, what was to be expected from a 17-year-old, right? Given a life sentence. But what exactly happened? Because was he did he actually commit it, or what actually happened there?
What actually happened in the case?
Yes.
Sure. The Curtis Brooks case, he was 15 years old. He had no criminal history. And it was in 1995. He had been assaulted by his mother and left to live on the streets. And so one night during a snowstorm, he was sheltering in a mall playing video games when he was approached by 3 juveniles. And these 3 kids had prior criminal history for robbery and had actually stolen guns that day and committed several burglaries throughout the day. Well, they collided with Curtis and told Curtis that they would give him a place to sleep if he would help them jack a car. And Curtis was handed a gun and was just told to fire a warning shot in the air outside in the parking lot when an innocent young man was leaving an ATM. And Curtis did what he was told and fired the warning shot in the air. And then unexpectedly, one of the 3 juveniles shot and killed the victim for his car. So he was charged with first-degree felony murder. And first-degree felony murder in Colorado was a mandatory life without parole sentence. And it's felony murder if you agree to help before, after, or during the commission of a felony. And he had confessed to this crime. And unfortunately, the ringleader, who was white, was 13 years old, could only be charged as a juvenile. And he only received a 5-year sentence in the youth offender system. And despite no criminal history and not firing the fatal shot, Curtis, who is black, received no plea offers. And unfortunately, he was forced to trial, and there was a confession on felony murder. We did our best, but he was found guilty of first-degree felony murder. And after the verdict, I went back and talked to the jurors, and they were crying. They had no idea it was a mandatory life without parole sentence. So yes, Curtis has always admitted his role. He has taken full responsibility, but a life without parole sentence for a child with no criminal history for not killing something without killing somebody is absolutely harsh, unjust, and cruel and unusual. And that's basically what the Supreme Court found in 2012, that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles was unconstitutional.
And so there was a somewhat of racial disparity involved there too, it seems like.
Absolutely, there was racial disparity. This case occurred in Arapahoe County, which had affluent white cities and a lot of the primary jurors, and then you had other predominantly indigent persons of color. And so in this particular case, the 2 white juveniles, even though they were the 3 juveniles who had prior criminal history, and the one ringleader, white, only did 5 years, and then the other white juvenile who had done all the crimes earlier that day and had prior criminal history was the only one that got a plea bargain. And whereas the shooter juvenile, who was black, was sentenced to life without parole, and Curtis, who was black, who had minimal involvement, was sentenced to life without parole. And the district attorney's office refused to negotiate. And then as I continued to help Curtis later on in his resentencing bid and clemency bid, the prosecutor refused to enter into plea negotiations even at that time, up until 2018.
Wow. And what was Curtis like, from the time he was 17, when he was given that sentence to when he was, I believe, 41 when he was released? What was the difference there?
Sure. I first met him when he was 15, and he was immediately incarcerated in the jail awaiting trial. He was young, full of bravado, acted like he didn't care about anything, impetuous, completely immature, and you could tell he was incredibly scared but didn't want to show it. And then to when he was 17 and sentenced, already being incarcerated for 2 years, obviously he took it out on me. I was the only person he could take it out on, cussed me out, called me a public pretender, and, it was all my fault that he was being sentenced to life without parole, which was painful for me, but it was so understandable as a child who came from a horrific, abusive childhood and then just received a life without parole sentence. And then we lost touch for a while, but when we reunited, when he needed my assistance in filing a petition for clemency, and when there was a possibility of him being resentenced, he was a completely different person. He had grown up. He was remorseful. He had taught himself different languages. I assisted financially for him to take college courses. And he is an amazing young man. And it was an honor to reunite with him And both of us worked hard to get all the materials together, and had some prominent people agree to go to the prison to meet Curtis to realize that he deserved a second chance. And so it was in December of 2018 that Colorado Governor Hickenlooper granted him clemency and commuted his life without parole sentence, pretty much ended it beginning July 1st, 2019. And he has got out of prison. He has done amazing. He's married. They own a house together. He's working. And it's a great story. And unfortunately, he should have been able to do that a lot sooner than spending 24 years in prison, because he was definitely worth a second chance. He was a good person and is a good person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just real quick, I know at times you also tried death penalty cases. What was that like?
Death penalty cases it takes the stress, the anxiety, the pressure to a whole different level. It's very intense. I think obviously, being a public defender and reading everything, I'm against the death penalty. All the studies, not only that it's, racially disparate, but its emotional and mental toll on everyone involved is incredible. It's the victim's family, it's the prosecutors, it's the defense lawyers. If you're representing someone that is going to be killed, it's an incredible amount of pressure. And luckily, I was very lucky in the sense that the 5 cases that I had that were going to charge with the death penalty, I successfully negotiated with the prosecutor and got them to agree to drop the death penalty. And so I was able then to try those cases without the death penalty being part of the punishment.
That's good.
Yeah, it's absolutely good. And Colorado now has abolished the death penalty. They've abolished the death penalty for juveniles, but the death penalty not only is just how horrible it is financially, just the mental toll on everyone involved, including my understanding of victims and their families, meaning the victims' families.
Yeah.
In that scenario, I just don't think it's good for anything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what advice, if you have any advice to give, what advice would you give other public defenders?
Sure. I guess looking back now at being a trial lawyer for 30 years and being a public defender for 12 years, I always think of, when you're sitting on an airplane and the announcement, if there's an emergency, be sure to put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. And unfortunately, if we wait until there is an emergency to put your oxygen mask on before helping others, it's too late. And so, you can't wait for an emergency. You've got to take care of yourself, self-care in the process. You have to absolutely have positive self-talk, exercise, meditate, whatever personal time for things that you enjoy. You have to make time for it. And as a public defender, I never thought I had, the opportunity to take that time, because you're constantly working on all your cases. You didn't want to stop because you couldn't stop. But in hindsight, in order to be the best trial lawyer, attorney, public defender, you absolutely have to take care of yourself. And so my advice to young public defenders or anyone in the criminal justice system is that you have to figure that out early. And if you need help, if you need somebody who's just going to, be a coach or ensure that you take that time out for yourself. And I know it's very difficult for people with children who have other family obligations, but that would be my advice. Take care of yourself first.
Thank you so much. And right now, how's your stress level? How's your mental health right now?
Well, it's so much better because when I've opened my own firm, I did that with the goal of having balance in my life, to make sure I'm an avid pickleball player, and I enjoy golf and cycling, and to have a personal life, and then do the select cases, and I can still do them just as well. So that really has been a key for my mental health. Sleeping a lot better and a lot happier, less anxiety.
Good. That's very good to know. And thank you so much, Holland, for coming on today.
Absolutely, Robin. I appreciate having the time to talk to you.
No problem at all. You have a wonderful day.
You too.
Everyone, thank you so much for listening. That was trial lawyer Hollynd Hoskins. I am very grateful.